Well, good morning. Wonderful to see all of you here. Before I start, I want to give a special thank you to John for leading us in our singing this morning, for being healthy. I really do appreciate that. For those of you who are not on the leadership email list that goes around, just to fill you in, you were about this close to having me lead the singing and Scott Wheeler back me up on spoons. That would not have been a good Sunday morning for you or for me. So thank you again, John. Really appreciate that. This morning, I'd like to talk about compassion. Compassion. And I'd like to maybe start off by hearing from you guys, okay? And I'm not going to ask that the microphone go around yet, well, maybe later on in the sermon, but right now, just in one or two words, when you hear the word compassion, what comes to mind? Help me out. What was that? No? One or two words, what comes to mind? Yes? Love your neighbor as yourself. Wonderful. Yes? To suffer with. Wonderful. I like that one. To suffer with. Toronto Maple Leafs. Next. Rejection. Okay, compassion, folks. Let's get back on topic here. What else do we think of when we hear the word compassion? To suffer with, to love your neighbor. Yes?
Extraordinary kindness.
Extraordinary kindness. So not just kindness, extraordinary kindness. Wonderful. Anyone else? Empathy. Wonderful. Empathy. Thank you, Dave. Yeah? Yes? Action. I like that. Action. Yeah. One more. Haven't heard from this side. They've been pulling all the weight. Come on, guys. Compassion. What's something that comes to mind? Tyler, you're so deep in thought back there. Anything?
I'm not actually deep in thought.
You're not that deep in thought. All right. All right. Well, we'll leave that there. Let me segue with a bit of a story. This actually is a post. It's a Facebook post that comes from my father-in-law's Facebook feed. I was waiting in line, a long, slow line, to check out. And while most of us were in a hurry to get out of there, I was situated beside a woman who was teasing the woman in front of her that was holding up the line because she was price matching. It turned out the women were friends, and I commented to the teasing woman that I had all my flyers ready and nothing in my cart was going through at full price. I noticed her friend had a 5 or 6-year-old daughter who was autistic. The young child was obviously getting tired sitting in the cart and wanted to go. She began kicking her mother and pushing off the counter with her feet and almost tipped over the cart. An elderly man in line caught the cart and set it upright. The child reached out and hit the man in the shoulder. He turned to her and laughed and asked if she was looking for trouble. The mother was embarrassed and was apologizing and trying to get out as quick as she could. I told the mom that it is all fine. Take your time. The older gentleman tried to talk to the child and to occupy her attention. At one point, he held the front of the cart so that it didn't slam into anyone while the child was pushing off and to keep it upright. At one point, the child threw her head forward and banged it on the card reader. I stepped over to see if she was okay. Her mother apologized again, saying her daughter was tired. It seemed like everybody was concerned. "Oh, sweetie, are you okay?" was the comment from most in line. A woman behind me had a small dog in her arms and came up and asked if the child wanted to pet her dog, which considering what had just transpired, I don't know that was the best thing, at least for the safety of the dog. Anyways, I digress. Let me go back to the story here. All right. The child stopped and fixed her attention on the puppy. It wasn't a long distraction, but enough to allow her mother to finish checking out. As they left, all of us waved by and said, "Bye-bye, sweetie." Chris and I were blessed to have healthy children, and thank God for that. I was extremely impressed with the kind actions of the people in line with me that day. And I personally couldn't begin to imagine how difficult it would be to raise a child with a disability. The message of kindness, or may I be so bold as to insert compassion, was preached that day, not from a pulpit, not in a church, but in, of all places, a Walmart. Compassion. What a wonderful example of compassion. But today I would like to look to Scripture, and I'd like to look at two examples of compassion that we see. Two examples, actually, of Jesus showing compassion. The first example comes by way of Mark. Mark, and in his Gospel, chapter 1, verses 40 to 42, it says, "And a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him and saying, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' Moved with compassion." Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. So, a little bit of context here. Jesus has now reached the prime of his ministry. He has already called his disciples, and he has now gone out. He is teaching in the synagogues. He is preaching to the multitudes. And here in this passage and surrounding it, Mark is demonstrating how Jesus has power over sickness. He has power over demons, because he's just recently casted some demons out. And so Mark is demonstrating Jesus' power. And here Jesus is approached by a leper, and he heals him. Now, leprosy is a physical disease. It is a skin disease. But in addition to being a physical disease, in that society, at that time, leprosy was seen very much as a metaphor for sin. If you read Leviticus chapter 13, there's this long description of what the priest was to do with someone who was a leper or suspected of being a leper. It explains how the priest was supposed to review the person, look them over, and if they're not sure, to kind of quarantine them for a period of time, and then go back, review them again. All these instructions for the priest. And so this is a physical problem. But in addition to that, it is a spiritual problem. And it is also a social problem. Because with leprosy, you were shunned. You were pushed aside. You couldn't intermingle for fear that others would catch that disease. And Jesus, moved with compassion, reaches out. He touches him. He touches the leper, and he heals him. And he heals the whole person, physically, but socially, even spiritually. Moved with compassion. The next passage I would like to look at comes by way of Matthew. And in chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, it says, "Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from the cities. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and felt compassion for them, and healed their sick." And a little bit broader context, what happens right following this is Jesus is preaching to this multitude of people, and it's getting late, and they're starting to get hungry, and so the disciples tell Jesus, these people are getting hungry, you probably want to send them on their way. They're far from home, they need food. And so Jesus, what does he do? He feeds the 5,000 people. Well, plus really. But that there he has further compassion in feeding those people. But this is actually a part of an even larger narrative, because what Matthew is doing in this passage is he is demonstrating this contrast. Because the passage prior to Jesus feeding the multitude, we have Herod throwing a banquet. And so the broader passage is this contrast between these two banquets. The first banquet is being thrown by a king, by Herod. And there's food, probably very prestigious people that he wants to impress, some alcohol, and it's all flowing. And at some point, Herodias' daughter, so this is Herod's wife's daughter, she gets up to entertain the crowd, and she starts dancing. And Herod, in his wisdom and a little bit of booze, he promises the daughter anything she wants, up to half the kingdom. And this daughter, prompted by her mother, says, ask for the head of John the Baptist. Ask for the head of John the Baptist. See, Herodias didn't like John the Baptist because he'd been preaching against their marriage. And so the daughter does so. And so here you have this story of this banquet, the people and the celebration and the entertainment, and it ends with a bloody mess, with a head freshly severed entering this room. And then you have another banquet. You have a banquet with another king, but not an earthly king. We have Jesus. And Jesus is there with not prestigious people, just people who have been following him. And these people, they're getting hungry. Unlike the first banquet, there wasn't all this nicely prepared food. No, there was some fish, some loaves. And yet Jesus, at his banquet, he feeds the people. In the first banquet, we see a king who is motivated by prestige, by greed, by power, not wanting to lose face. And yet, in the second banquet, we have a king who is motivated by compassion. He felt compassion. This word compassion, we see it first in Mark 1:41, and it says, Jesus was moved by compassion. Moved by compassion, which speaks to how his behavior was influenced. Then in Matthew 14:14, it says Jesus felt compassion. He felt it. It was an emotion, and it speaks to how he was moved on an inner level. This particular version of the Greek word for compassion, which, good luck if I can say that, splegnizomai. If anyone else wants to try it, feel free. But this particular version of the Greek verb here, it occurs 12 times in Scripture. All of them in the Gospels, most of them with Jesus. And each and every time, there is this idea that someone is moved both in their feelings and in their actions. The word compassion here really denotes this idea that they're moved to their inner core. Now, in a Jewish sense, they would say they're moved to their bowels, which in our context, we wouldn't usually use that term. We might use a different metaphor. We might say you're moved to your core. You're moved to your soul. You are moved to your heart. But it's not just an emotion. It is an emotion that leads to action. And what we see here is that this is what compassion is. See, to feel compassion but not act really isn't compassion. That's pity or sympathy, but not compassion. To act on compassion, but not feel it on the inside, well, that's not really compassion either. That's more legalism or ritual. No, compassion is when you have this consistency between how you feel and how you behave towards others. And we see that in Jesus Christ. We see that consistency there. He was truly compassionate. Something that I think is oftentimes pondered in Christian circles. I know I've pondered it, especially when I was at Bible college. I remember this was a common theme that went around was how do we know the will of God? How do we hear his voice? How do we discern God's will in our life? I think these are great questions. I think that as Christians, we know that to do the will of God is to be Christ-like. Now, oftentimes when we ask for God's will, what we are saying we want is we want a roadmap. We want to know, God, where am I supposed to be 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road? But if you're really interested in knowing God's will, it's not about a roadmap. It's not about a destination. It's about today. And we see that Jesus was compassionate. And so to be in the will of God is to be compassionate. And I would suggest that there's 2 key points or 2 key questions to ponder if you are wanting to know God's will for you. And that is, do you see a need? And do you have the ability to meet that need? Do you see a need? Do you have the ability to meet that need? And Jesus saw the man with leprosy. And Jesus saw these people who needed to be healed. And Jesus saw this multitude of people who were hungry. He saw a need. And Jesus had the ability to heal that leper. He had the ability to feed the multitude and to heal their sick. And he acted on it. I am not going to say to you today that every single time you answer yes to these 2 questions, it is automatically God's will for you to act on those. But I would say that if you can answer yes to these 2 questions, that it deserves a moment to pause and to pray and to prayerfully consider if this is God's way of unveiling his will for me today in this moment. Compassion. I'd like to ask another question, and maybe this time we will get the microphone going around. I'd like to ask, do you think as a society, do you think that we've become less compassionate over time? And if so, why? Actually, maybe before people respond individually, let's see a show of hands. How many here would say, as a society, over the last, say, 20, 40, 60 years, as a whole, we have become less compassionate? Who would agree with that? Okay? How many of you would say, no, I think that as a society, we're probably about the same, maybe even more? How many of you would say that? Okay? Okay. So fairly even split. So those of you in the first camp, is there anyone who could explain why you think that? Why do you think that as a society we have become less compassionate? Is there anyone? Yes.
I sometimes think about our society in contrast to a television show years ago called Little House on the Prairie, right? Where you saw this little village, and neighbors would sort of take turns going through difficult times, and the neighbors would rise up and care about one another, and it was really quite beautiful. But in our society, you turn on your TV to get the morning news before work, and we check our emails, and we see the internet. We're inundated with all kinds of pain and suffering and trauma, and we actually have to practice the skill of shutting off to be able to cope ourselves because we can't handle it all, and so we become desensitized. And then, unfortunately, we start to pick and choose. It isn't will I or won't I help my one neighbor who's in pain, but out of the 20 people who are suffering, I start picking and choosing, well, maybe I'll help this one and not those. And so I tended to vote for yes, I think so because of my own personal experience, that we're just so much more aware of so much suffering in contrast to something like a village that we saw in Little House on the Prairie.
Okay. Thank you, Brad. So a little bit too much information makes it harder. We don't know what to do. Yeah.
I didn't vote for either.
Okay. You cheated.
The reason I didn't is I thought, to me, it was a trick question.
Okay.
Because in our society, I think when it comes to organized, like on Facebook, and you saw little baby freeze the other day, and everybody gave over $100,000.
Yeah.
When it comes to organized compassion, I think we maybe do more. When it comes to knowing our neighbor or on the small stuff, we don't do.
Okay. Okay. So compassion is expressed differently today, maybe. Not more, not less, or, yeah. Okay. Back here. Oh, sorry.
I think we have tremendous technology now.
Yes.
But I say this, and we've become more technology driven. There was a time when I think our society was relationship driven. I saw this in my career, and at the end, even in public accounting, I saw it became so technology driven. I had bankers call the office to answer a return phone call, and if they found out I was in, they'd want to leave a message on voicemail, like they didn't want to interact.
Okay.
And I think the less removed we become in those dealings with people,
Okay.
I think we become desensitized, and I really think that is a major issue.
Okay.
Like the technology needs to be coupled with, they call that the soft. We need the people side of things and the people interactions.
Thank you. Thank you. I hear that word desensitized again, and that we've been pulled away by technology. Okay, that we're more consumed with technology than with people. Thank you.
I voted that we were as compassionate or
Thank you.
more compassionate
Yes.
because I think we see the media and all the negative because that's what the media concentrates on. They don't concentrate on the families that support a neighbor next door by taking a meal. I see that in my job. The neighbors who support elderly people in the community without any wanting any reward is amazing. I actually think we should have some kind of reward for, not monetary, but as a community to sort of recognize those kinds of situations. And now that I work with children, I see the volunteers that provide support to children in need, and I think we are probably more
Wonderful.
compassionate than we ever have been. And we're teaching our children to be more compassionate.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathy, for renewing our hope in our society today. I appreciate that. Anyone else who agrees with Kathy, who wants to comment on why you think our society is just as compassionate as it ever has been?
This is for our side because we're getting beat up by that side. Without getting too political, I find myself, we start thinking the government should do everything. To Kathy's point and Brad's, that the Little House on the Prairie thing is the perfect example. It was community.
Yep.
You didn't want your name known, but it seems now it's easier to just throw money at the government and let them do it for us to some degree. And I think there's way more behind the scenes, as Kathy said. People just helping people. We just need to do that more often. I don't know if we need to get recognized for that, but it certainly wouldn't hurt because other people then would see that and maybe come out and help out on little things.
Okay.
But I think the government, we just think they're going to do it all, and they aren't. We
Okay.
have to do it.
Thank you. A good reminder that though the government has a role to play, that doesn't absolve us of needing to act as well. All right, one more comment right here. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that there may be an upswing of being more gentle and kind to people in our society because I think people are very much aware of what's going on the other side of the world. You know, we're looking at these barbaric things that are happening, and people are fearful. And I kind of feel like strangers that I don't even know, they do so many kind things for me lately. And I notice that, you know, just when I'm outside my home doing my regular chores and stuff. And I sort of have my eye out now looking for kindnesses, you know, and I was in the grocery checkout line, and you know the bar you put across to separate your groceries from the other person?
Yep.
On the bar it said, the milk of human kindness. I mean, I know it was only advertising milk, right? But nevertheless, it kind of caught my eye. It's like, it's good to see things like that and to be reminded. Let's keep the milk of human kindness flowing.
Thank you, thank you. Wonderful. So I'm hearing a couple of themes. One of them is around information and how we have so much more information. How, on one hand, some of you are saying that that can connect us to more people, make us more compassionate, but on the other hand, sometimes too much information is just, well, too much, and that we don't know how to respond to that information and how to respond to the needs out there, especially when there's so many and we're asking, well, what can I do? As I was looking over this topic, I came across a wonderful TED Talk. You all know what a TED Talk is, right? Okay. So I came across this wonderful talk that by Daniel Goleman, and he doesn't try to argue that we have become more compassionate as a society or less compassionate, but he does try to answer the question of why aren't we more compassionate? And I encourage you to watch the entire talk, but for this morning, I would like to show you just about a 3-minute clip out of that talk. Take a look at this.
You know, I'm struck by how one of the implicit themes of TED is compassion, these very moving demonstrations we've just seen, HIV in Africa, President Clinton last night. And I'd like to do a little collateral thinking, if you will, about compassion and bring it from the global level to the personal. I'm a psychologist, but rest assured I will not bring it to the scrotal. There was a very important study done a while ago at Princeton Theological Seminary that speaks to why it is that when all of us have so many opportunities to help, we do sometimes and we don't other times. A group of divinity students at the Princeton Theological Seminary were told that they were going to give a practice sermon, and they were each given a sermon topic. Half of those students were given as a topic the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who stopped the stranger to help the stranger in need by the side of the road. Half were given random Bible topics. Then one by one, they're told they had to go to another building and give their sermon. As they went from the first building to the second, each of them passed a man who was bent over and moaning, clearly in need. The question is, did they stop to help? The more interesting question is, did it matter they were contemplating the parable of the Good Samaritan? Answer, no, not at all. What turned out to determine whether someone would stop and help a stranger in need was how much of a hurry they thought they were in. Were they feeling they were late? Or were they absorbed in what they were going to talk about? And this is, I think, the predicament of our lives, that we don't take every opportunity to help because our focus is in the wrong direction. There's a new field in brain science, social neuroscience, that studies the circuitry in two people's brains that activates while they interact. And the new thinking about compassion from social neuroscience is that our default wiring is to help. That is to say, if we attend to the other person, we automatically empathize, we automatically feel with them. They're these newly identified neurons, mirror neurons, that act like a neural Wi-Fi, activating in our brain exactly the areas activated in theirs. We feel with automatically. And if that person is in need, if that person is suffering, we're automatically prepared to help. At least that's the argument. But then the question is, Why don't we? And I think this speaks to a spectrum that goes from complete self-absorption to noticing, to empathy, and to compassion. And the simple fact is, if we are focused on ourselves, if we're preoccupied, as we so often are throughout the day, we don't really fully notice the other. And this difference between the self and the other focus can be very subtle. I was doing my
I watched this clip and the entire talk. I was overcome by two emotions in preparing the sermon for today. The first emotion was discouragement. I felt discouraged. I felt, wow, if a group of divinity students, those who are studying and preparing to go into ministry and be compassionate as a profession and help others, if a group of those students studying the parable of the Good Samaritan, a parable that uses that same tense of the Greek word, one of those 12 times, if they are no further moved to actually act out their compassion than the other group of students who were just given the random passage of Scripture, then really, what hope have I? I mean, really, what hope have I today that, I mean, as good a sermon as I will try to preach, as I will try to prepare, what hope have I that when this is done and you walk out those doors, that it will all be for naught, that it will be forgotten, really? But then that was followed up by a feeling of hope. A feeling of hope, because the reality is, I don't need to convince you to be compassionate, because I know that about you guys. I know that I am standing in a room that is filled with compassionate people. I know that I am looking at people who help out in our Sunday school department with the kids. I know that I'm looking at people who help every week set up this room for church and tear it down afterwards. I know that I'm looking at people who help us out by preparing snacks in our coffee area, by giving food donations to the students at this college. I know that I am looking at people who help out with our music, who help out in our leadership areas, who help out with Bible studies, who give their homes to host those Bible studies. And I know that about you. I know that you give generously, financially in the offering plate. I know that many of you help out outside this church. You help out with your friends, with your neighbors or your co-workers. And I do know that about you. I know that I am looking at a group of very compassionate people. And so maybe my challenge is not to convince you today to be more compassionate. Maybe what my challenge for you today is to ask you to be more observant. Can you be more observant? Can you take time out of your busy schedules, take time to pause and look at others and their needs? And of course, when I came to that point, I also had to reflect on myself. As many of you who know me well know that I'm also someone who keeps a very busy schedule. And that can be the challenge. In the midst of the busyness, in the midst of the list of the to-dos that we want to check off, can we take that time and can we pause and look at others? I really liked what Daniel Goleman had to say, but really, I think we do, of course, need to bring it back to Scripture, and so I would like to do just that. I'd like you to consider Jesus Christ. Now, we see him throughout the Gospels doing so many incredible things, healing people and preaching and showing compassion in all sorts of different ways. And it's really interesting when you think about Jesus had such a short ministry. Really, it was only about 3 years in length. 3 years, considering all that he did. And that's a short ministry. Scott, how long have you been in ministry?
19 years.
About 19 years. Dave, how long have you been in ministry?
About the same time.
About the same time. And here Jesus, 3 years. 3 years. And yet, in that short amount of time, we see all that he did, and yet he never seemed to be in a rush. He never seemed to be in a hurry. Let's go back to those two passages. Now, the first passage that I read was from Mark, and that's where Jesus was healing the leper. But this time, I'd like to go to the lead up to that passage. So instead of Mark 1, 40 to 42, we're going to look at Mark 1, 35 to 39. It says, "In the early morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went away to a secluded place." Went away to a secluded place and was praying there. Simon and his companions searched for him. They found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." He said to them, "Let us go somewhere else to the towns nearby, so that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for." And he went into their synagogues throughout all Galilee, preaching and casting out demons. The other passage was Matthew 14, 13, and 14. So let's just look at Matthew 14, verse 13, where it says, and again, this is right before he healed the sick and he fed the 5,000. It says, "Now when Jesus heard about John, he withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed him on foot from their cities." And here we see this trend. And I've shown it to you twice here. If I showed you those other 12 passages where that Greek tense of the word compassion, we would see it not in every single one, but in almost all of them, in most of them, shortly before or shortly after Jesus expresses compassion and acts on it, we see Jesus taking time. We see a pause. He's taking time to reflect, to pray, taking time for himself, and taking time to orientate himself to others and to their needs. And so I feel that this morning, that's the challenge. It's not to be more compassionate, as I know that you already are. The challenge I would like to leave you today is to consider your busy schedules and to consider, have you made room to be observant? Is there room in there to pause and to look at others? Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your grace, for your mercy, and today for your compassion. And you are the compassionate Christ, the one who came, the one who gave his life for us. But while on earth, Lord, you gave us such wonderful examples of how through your feeling for others, you acted, you reached out, and you touched those in need. You provided healing where necessary. We thank you for that example. Thank you that we could be at the receiving end of your compassion. But Lord, help us to go out and do likewise. Help us in the midst of this busy world with all the things that we feel we need to do, in the midst of all the information we gather from Facebook feeds and news feeds and other internet feeds, Lord, that we would hear your voice and we would see those whom we are called to reach out to and to express compassion to. Pray all this in your holy name. Amen and amen. I'd like to take a few moments if there are any questions or comments, and we'll get the microphone to go around again. But just before we do, I'm also going to get the baskets started. So I'm not sure who is on call for running the baskets around today, but if we can get the, was it the innies? No, the outies go out first, then the innies. So if the first set of baskets will have pens and envelopes, and you get to take out of the second set of baskets you put back into, and so we'll get those going around now. As they're going around, questions, comments. So right over here.
I resonate with everything you're saying today, and Pauline and I have had opportunities over the years to step into people's lives either directly or anonymously, and there's just this great inner satisfaction that comes from doing that. Yeah. And I think we can all experience that. But let me just open my heart here and tell you where I struggle with this whole thing. Sure. I'm not sure I know how to handle the situation where I meet the guy when I go into Canadian Tire who's standing at the stop sign, a young man in his 20s who has a sign that says my family needs food, or at the same location an older gentleman sitting in a lawn chair with a Tim Hortons coffee in his hand looking for handouts, or someone on George Street downtown. And I really struggle in those situations. And the question I have is this an opportunity to help this person, or am I enabling this person?
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I don't know what to do in those situations. Yeah. The other ones where I see a need and understand that need, and Pauline and I have stepped into those no question. Yeah. That's an easy one. But it's when I get approached anonymously and asked for something that I struggle with it. And if you got any advice, I'm a willing recipient.
Before I respond to that, I think that's something that we can all resonates with all of us, right? And I'd be curious to hear what other wisdom we have in this room. So, who else has? Yes, right here.
I work on George Street as well, and I walked on Friday 2 blocks from my building down to the bank, and I had 6 panhandlers stop me and ask for something. And when I was younger, I grew up in New York City, and I know that my families, we were definitely not the richest family. And every morning, though, my parents would put us 3 kids in an assembly line, and we would get, okay, so you're doing the bread today, you're doing the tuna, and we'd make little lunches, and we'd give out that to the homeless. But my struggle was on Friday is that I knew I was going to be seeing a lot of people that were panhandling, and they're so young. And so I filled my purse with granola bars. And some of them took them, some of them didn't. But when I was walking, I let them know where the food banks were. And I don't think they needed actually my money that time. I think they actually needed someone actually to say good morning to them as well. Like, that was a big thing, because when you see that many people on the street, you ignore them sometimes. There's just so many of them. You can't give them to everybody, your money to everybody, so you just start looking down. You don't make eye contact, but even just saying a good morning to them, I find, for me, is that they're human as well.
Absolutely.
So.
Good. Tony.
It's one of those things where it's really difficult, especially when you've got 6 people coming up to you in a 2-block walk, right? It's really difficult to decide what makes sense and what do they actually need it, and that kind of thing. And I think one of the things that I've always tried to do, I'm never really good at it, but I've tried to do, is separate myself from and my thoughts from the need that's presented in front of me. I don't know if they're in need or not, and it's not really my responsibility to decide. And so sometimes if I have the means, like if I have even a toonie in my car and I pass the guy at Canadian Tire, I'll give the toonie to him, because I don't know if he's in need or not. I don't know if he's just looking for money, or if he actually has a family that he's trying to provide for. That's God's responsibility and not mine. And so my responsibility is to do what I can to meet the needs of people. And it's a hard one. I totally get where Dave's coming from, because it's difficult, because you see it everywhere, and especially downtown. But I just really try and have an attitude of compassion, and also in the sense of, whose resources am I giving away right now?
Yes.
Is it mine or is it God's? Because if it's mine, then it becomes personal. But if I'm giving away God's resources, which really technically it is, then I should be able to do that and trust that God's going to take care of where that's going. So that's just a little
Good.
thing that I've...
Thank you for that. Anyone else? Yes, back here.
I think just not having the guilt of you can't do everything, and to let, again, God lead you. And it's like, witnessing to people. All you can do is your part, and then it's up to God.
Thank you. And in the back row, I think we had...
The TED Talk I thought was really excellent, and it reminded me of a social psychology study that was done in a really large city where they, the researchers intentionally put a man tipped over in a wheelchair on the street to see what were the conditions that were happening that would cause people to stop and help the man who was tipped over in his wheelchair. And people continued to rush past, and the biggest factor that they came up with on whether or not people stopped is if somebody else stopped first.
Absolutely.
And when somebody else stopped to help this poor man, they would then enter into it as well, which says that when we have compassion, we're not only impacting people who are needing our compassion, but we're making a difference in the people around us as well because of that sort of sociological concept.
Absolutely. Very good point. Yeah.
I'm not downtown really often, but I was a while back with a friend of mine, and we almost walked past someone who was looking for handouts. And my friend, because she has had a history with working with people, stopped because she knew the person. And we didn't give her any money. We just stopped and spent a few moments and talked with her and encouraged her and listened, and we're just a caring person, someone to be there, to share a part of the day, to encourage just a little bit. And it struck me that gift was probably way bigger than somebody tossing a coin somewhere, because it was based on relationship. It was based on, I know you, you have value. And to me, I think that's a more compassionate gesture than just tossing some money at somebody, because it says that you're important and I'm going to take my time, which is bigger today than our money. And I think sometimes, that's the greater gift that we can do. And it was funny because it wasn't something that I would have done, but my friend is the kind of person that does. And I stood back and thought, I've learned something really important today. And it's going to change who I am. And for her, it was based on relationship. And I thought, okay, maybe I need to be looking at this differently.
Thank you.
This is an interesting quandary, because I can really relate to Dave, because I see a lot of situations when I'm out that where you do have people waiting and things, and there's so much a stigma in our society of people taking advantage of the system, and so there's kind of a deep-seated almost resentment towards people who we think, well, why don't they go to a food bank or a mission or a church or something like that, to where in some ways we play God a little bit, other ways maybe we are being prudent. I'll never forget, there was a guy came to my door a couple of years ago. We had a big snowstorm, and he and his son, and he knocked on the door in the morning. He said, I'll shovel your driveway for $10 or whatever it was. And I had $10, so I said, sure. And he did a great job. And afterwards I was paying him, and he said, yeah, I'm out of work, so I'm just trying to do what I can. And I thought, that's a guy I love giving to. So I gave him $20 because it was just, he showed initiative, he was positive, he was kind, all those kind of things. That's an easy situation to give. Sometimes it's a situation where somebody, and sometimes I've gotten people a cup of coffee. Like I'll say, hey, do you want a coffee? And I'll go to Timmy's and bring them back a coffee and have a coffee with them. Or sometimes they do get money. At one time I went to Toronto, I brought a $10 Timmy's card, and I said, God, somebody needs this card. So, who can I give it to? Because I hate Tim Hortons. And so I was, just went around, and there was this lady who was sitting outside a bookstore, and I gave her the $10 cards. Other times, I just walked right by. and don't notice because I'm busy or I don't care or, anything like that. So it really is, I think it's a case-by-case thing for a lot of us, to where we go. I remember Dave Kennedy once said, the stigma often with poor people is not that they live in poverty, but that they have no friends.
Yeah.
Really, the greatest asset anybody can have is friends. If your house burned down, who do you know in your circle of people that you could go stay at their house, and for how long, that's wealth, really. Yeah. Whereas a lot of people on the street, they don't have friends, they don't have those connections, and sometimes it's related to mental illness and all kinds of things. So it's a great question, but I think it's one we have to keep asking over and over and over again, because there are some situations where we need to jump in with both feet. There's other situations where maybe it is something where you go by. You really need the wisdom of Solomon to figure it out.
Scott, I love your story there of going to Toronto and passing on the gift card to someone whom you said otherwise you may pass and just not even notice, and how you took the time prior to going to Toronto to orientate yourself to the potential of the needs of others. Dave, that's a great question, and thank you for opening up this wonderful discussion. And I hope you're not going to walk away with a definite answer, because I think that would defeat the whole point of it, right? On one hand, Tony makes a great point that, who are we to be judge and jury of the needs of others, right? Let God, determine that. But to the points made by some others, like if we were to give to every single need we see, not just every person on the street, but every time we were to see, say, a commercial for a hungry child in Africa, it wouldn't be long before we would become the one in need, right? So where do we balance those two extremes, right? And that's why those questions that I alluded to earlier, to ask, do I see a need? Do I have the ability to meet that need? But then not simply to act, but to pause, to pray, to orientate yourself to those needs, and to ask God, is this one of those times where I'm to act or to not act? And so it's not going to be the same each and every time. We recognize, but thank you to Kate and to Krista for making this wonderful point that sometimes the need is not the immediate need that is presented, right? I mean, all you parents know this with children, right? What your child asks for and thinks they need is not actually what they really need. And that's not to say that people who are out panhandling don't need money, but it's to say that on a deeper level, there's this other thing that they need: respect. They need to be human. They need conversation. They need friendship, right? And that's one example of that. But throughout our journeys, just to be mindful that walking with the Lord, that we are to prayerfully consider what people truly do need. Yeah. Thank you for that wonderful discussion. Since I don't feel like singing, I'm going to give it to you, John. And, thank you so much.
Why don't